as you guys know, the Liberal Party is running a leadership race because Trudeau resigned and they got to replace him. And in this leadership race, we just got the news that Ruby Dhalla has been kicked out of the leadership race. So if you don't know who Ruby Dhalla is, she was a former MP from, I think she's from like Mississauga or something, or like near Toronto, like region. And yeah, she was a former MP who's running to be the leader of the Liberal Party. And remember, whoever wins the Liberal leadership race automatically becomes prime minister until the next election, whenever that will be, right? So the results will come out on March 9th. And if you're a registered Liberal, you can verify your identity, and next week you're going to be able to start voting for the next prime minister, basically. But until then, like, you know, there's things that has to happen. There's debates, and then there's like, you know, funding requirements that each candidate has to hit, and Ruby Dhalla has hit all of the funding requirements. But the Liberal Party, apparently they held a meeting where they decided that, you know, she's not qualified because of reasons we'll talk about. So the reasons why she was disqualified was because apparently she faced 12 allegations of accepting donations from a corporation in the form of payments to campaign staff. And this is something that is not allowed under the Liberal Party leadership race rules. And she was also accused of failing to disclose the involvement of a non-Canadian citizen in her campaign, which the party alleges would amount to foreign interference if it happened during an election period. So there's stuff about, you know, Ruby Dhalla's, like, she's of Indian ancestry, and, you know, I think it was mentioned that she personally knows the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, and Modi featured her in like a promotional video or something. I didn't read too much into it, but apparently there's some like connection to Modi, and that's what. And Canada and India are not on the best terms right now because of, you know, unrelated reasons, but which we won't get into. But it's just, you know, there's a lot of pushback against the potential for foreign interference, especially if it's from like India and all that stuff. So yeah, basically this is pretty disappointing news to me. I don't know about for you guys, but full disclosure, I registered as a Liberal, even though my views are probably at this point not very aligned with the Liberal Party. But I registered as a Liberal because, again, whoever wins this race becomes the Prime Minister of Canada automatically, even if it's only for a few weeks, right? So this is a race that's super important, in my opinion. And I wanted to cast my ballot for Ruby Dhalla. And I actually wanted to cast my ballot for Chandra Arya. If you remember, we talked about him, but then he was disqualified as well. And now Ruby Dhalla has been disqualified also. So this news was really disappointing. And I found this tweet by Sharia Tees, who's you know, political analyst here in Canada. And he's basically saying that, hey, they kicked out every single ethnic minority candidate, right? So there are no people of color left in the race for the Liberal leader after they kicked out Ruby Dhalla. So they kicked out every single ethnic minority candidate. Can you imagine the reaction if it was done by the Conservatives? Right. So again, this is something that I noticed as well, where it seems like the left leaning parties, or just the left in general, is able to get away with a lot of this stuff, where the Liberal Party, they've been like, you know, promoting DEI and all this stuff, but then Ruby Dhalla was actually running on a platform of anti-DEI, and so was Chandra Arya. And it's interesting that the people of color are running against DEI, and then they also kicked out all the people of color for various reasons, right? They say they kicked out Chandra Arya for lack of French, and then now they're kicking out you know, Ruby Dhalla for potential for foreign interference and all this stuff. Really vague kind of accusations, and they're accusations, by the way. There's like none of this has been proven in court or anything. So yeah, it's just under what I would say suspicious reasons and vague reasons. So yeah, it's just a little icky to me. But maybe I'll save my opinions for a little bit later. I want to hear what you guys have to say first. But before that, let me just read you a statement by Ruby Dhalla herself, who posted on X after it was disclosed that she was going to be kicked out. So she said, in my campaign, there have been thousands of volunteers from all over Canada who have wanted to be part of history of having the first woman of color as Canada's next prime minister and the leader of the Liberal Party. I will not allow my campaign to be tarred with baseless allegations of foreign interference because of my Indian heritage and being the daughter of an immigrant. These types of comments are a direct attack on all immigrants, which I would not allow. Hashtag Ruby for PM. So, she's denying these accusations, and she's just basically saying it's all ridiculous, but she's probably not going to change the mind of the liberal leadership. So what are you going to do, right? So that's kind of the story that broke right before the when we started this podcast. I wanted to hear what you guys' thoughts are. Do you guys think that this is kind of why do you think they kicked out Ruby Dhalla? Do you think that they're like afraid of her because she's kind of the only one that was willing to openly go against Mark Carney, who's kind of the favorite to win right now? And do you think this is maybe even like racially motivated, as she was implying, right? Like herself, that like she's being targeted because of her Indian heritage? Or do you think that she's just, overblowing this because she's angry that she got kicked out? So, lots of angles you can go at this. So I leave the question open. Just your thoughts on this story in general.
I think that it's very clear from my perspective that they have selected their one to win, Mark Carney, and that's it. And they need to remove as much alternatives as possible to ensure that Mark Carney gets his coronation, whether or not he would have gotten it if alternatives had been available or not. I think it's very clear to me that the party has spoken, and they are not willing to risk the registered liberals surprising them and selecting not their candidate of choice. And by they, I mean the Liberal Party itself. So I think that Ruby just got caught in the crossfire, honestly, because I think it's pretty clear that Freeland is not going to beat Mark Carney, right? I don't think anyone is actually expecting that. Whereas Ruby was maybe more of a upset candidate, where it's like we don't really know who the heck she is to the extent that we know Freeland and Mark Carney now. So she was maybe a little bit more of a alternative that people may have chosen over their coronated king, Mark Carney. So instead of running the risk of her winning, they just found a reason to disqualify her. That's kind of the vibe I get. And I mean, maybe I'm not saying there's a definitive proof that she didn't do anything wrong, because I'm not I don't know exactly all the details on these the allegations, the donations, whatever. But I feel like I feel like it's a little convenient, if that makes sense, that they happen to find some shit on her that they could use, rather than just letting it play out, right? I feel like it's a little too convenient, especially after they already disqualified. Andy remembers his name, but I don't.
Chandra Arya.
Yeah. Since they already disqualified him for essentially a BS reason. I understand, French is important, but at the end of the day, does his ability to speak French make him a good leader or a bad leader? Not like it doesn't really say anything about his leadership. And maybe his unwillingness to learn it might have spoken to him being someone that wouldn't have been chosen, but at the end of the day, they didn't even let him try. Right? They just removed him. I hope he didn't have to pay the fee and then get disqualified after they took the fee, because I'm pretty sure Ruby paid the fee and they just are going to keep the money. Wow, thanks for that money, Ruby, in those donations to the party that you're then not allowed to actually run in, because I don't know if it's necessarily necessarily a race thing. I think it's more so they've already realized that Mark Carney is the best bet that they have to win the election, and they just decided they can't risk anyone else. At least that's my perspective. I maybe there's more to this that I'm unaware, but I think it's more so that they've decided that Mark Carney needs to win, and they're now making sure he wins, if that makes sense. That's kind of my take on it all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole coronation argument is pretty clear at this point. That like they're coronating Mark Carney as their leader. A lot of the sitting MPs endorsed him. I guess they see him as like a WEF friendly, like WEF friendly candidates, because like the Liberals are full of those kinds of candidates, like Chrystia Freeland and Justin and these young global leader type people, but they probably want to put a fresh face on it. So it just makes sense. They're coordinating their leader and they don't want anybody to really challenge him. But I also think there's like other aspects to this that are somewhat troubling and somewhat suspicious. One thing being that like I think Ruby Dahlia and Chandra Arya, and I think that a lot of this is cultural. They're the kinds of progressives that kind of reject that international leftist doctrine that people like Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney and the Joe Bidens of the world are very much proponents of. They're actually much more focused on like productivity and those kinds of things, and a lot less focused on carbon taxes and a lot of these international issues that Canada has kind of dived in during the Trudeau administration. So I think that it's a big risk to put somebody on a debate stage that really challenges these ideals. There's other issues here. I think that the whole line about foreign interference is being weaponized against people of color in Canada. Because I think that I don't believe that Ruby Dahlia and Chandra Arya are working for the Modi government. So I actually do think it's not like full on racist, but it's like, wow, that really makes people like me feel unwelcome in this country. And I think that they would probably use that line.
Imagine if the conservatives did that and how mad people would be, right?
They'd call them racist. They would use all the labels and the R words. So I think that, like you just said, the Liberals would never let the conservatives get away with this. And I don't think the conservatives would have the balls to remove a person of color from their leadership campaign. So I think that it's actually very problematic that they're weaponizing the language of foreign interference against people who, like Ruby, was born in this country, but because of the color of her skin and her cultural background, she has to have these weaponized against her now. That's a problem. And I think the Liberals are going to probably dive in deeper using that language. And I think it's going to push people like me who have for their whole lives been very progressive voters. And I switched before this Ruby situation, but like it's going to push more people like me away from the political left in Canada, because the political left are really showing their true colors, that their DEI and their diversity is all performative. They don't give a shit about people like me, and they don't want people like me running their party. And that's the truth. And I'll get a little bit more controversial about it. Like a lot of like the DNA of the Liberal Party is centered in Quebec, in like the Montreal region. Like people will accuse the Liberals of being Laurentian elites or whatever you want to say, whatever the terminology is. But a lot of the intellectual backing of the Liberal Party comes from that region of the country. There's a lot of French Canadian progressives that are in the Liberal caucus. And the one thing that's like unique about French Canadian progressives compared to the rest of the country is they happen to be arguably the most xenophobic people in the country. So I think there's a big problem with what would happen if the Liberal government actually nominated a brown person to be the leader of their country. I do not believe that the province of Quebec would for a second consider voting for a brown person to be leader of the country. I think that's also true for people of many different ethnic backgrounds. I think it's a very xenophobic, insular place that does openly hate, at times, not hate, but are resentful, or the way they talk about people of color is actually mostly insulting. And I think that the Liberal leadership doesn't want to deal with this situation where a brown person who doesn't speak French would actually lead this party, because they would destroy their coalition. They wouldn't win a seat in Quebec.
Yeah, and also just a couple of observations that I made maybe in a few episodes ago when we first talked about Chandra Arya, that I'll just reiterate now for people who didn't watch that episode. It's just funny to me how it's just the people of color are the ones that are pushing back against DEI the most, right? So out of this race, we've seen Ruby Dahlia and Chandra Arya, the two main people of color that threw their hat in the ring, that are the most anti-DEI candidates out of all the candidates that are running. And even if the Liberal Party, if they say that they're gonna die on this DEI hill, and they're so committed to the DEI cause, well, they just pushed out all the people of color from their race. So are they even really for DEI, right? So it's kind of a little bit of a hypocrisy going on at the Liberal Party leadership as well. So it's just funny to me how this whole DEI thing has gone completely twisted. And I do feel like the Liberals have just become another version of the US Democrats. So if you guys recall back in 2020, after such a resounding defeat at the hands of Donald Trump in 2016, the Democrats, they went back and then they reevaluated stuff. In reality, they didn't change anything. It was still the same old party that lost the 2016 election that just tried again in 2020, and they won only because of arguably, this is my opinion, but they only won because of COVID, where it threw a big shock. Otherwise, if it wasn't for COVID, I believe Trump would have won in 2020. But even before the general election, the way that they did the primaries, where it's the exact same thing that's happening now in Canada with Mark Carney, the Democrats did in 2020 with Joe Biden, right? So Joe Biden came in and he was the establishment favorite, and then he was doing well in the polls, but there was one challenger called Bernie Sanders that was really catching up to him in the polls, and at one point threatened to, I think at one point Sanders was polling even higher than Biden. And then the Democratic establishment, they're like, we can't have that. Bernie is he's an independent, technically. He's an independent senator, so he's not even officially part of the Democratic Party in the Senate. So it's like he's an outsider, right? So we can't have an outsider. We got to support our establishment favorite. So they got all the other people that are polling relatively well, but not as well as Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden. They got them to drop out and then endorse Biden. And then Biden started soaring in the polls, right? And, even back in 2016, it was even worse in 2016 because they had super delegates back then where it was just all Democratic establishment that had a disproportionate amount of votes, and they overwhelmingly went to Hillary Clinton, right? So they did it twice. They did it once in 2016, once in 2020. Yeah, and even in 2024, it's like, you know, nobody, they try to crush all the like people that are from within the Democratic Party that try to challenge Biden. So like there's a guy named Dean Phillips who's a congressman from Minnesota who tried to, you know, who raised the alarm bells from within the Democratic Party that, hey, maybe Biden is too old, maybe he's not all there, maybe he's not good enough to run for another term. And then they totally, you know, shut him out and try to railroad him basically. And you can read about all that story, and he was talking about it in the All In podcast actually. So when he was running for the Democratic nomination, he talked about all this when he was still running. But anyways, that's besides the point. So I'm seeing the whole kind of Democratic playbook being just kind of grabbed page by page, exact copy and paste, and put into the Liberal Party playbook. And yeah, I hope it doesn't work, but who knows? Maybe Canadians are more left leaning than Americans in general. So, you know, in this case, unfortunately, I think the Liberal Party is what's called the natural governing party. Now, I don't know if like how accurate that statement is, but I've heard people say that because Canada's, you know, if you had to choose left or right, Canada usually chooses left, all things, you know, else being equal. But yeah, I mean, this Democrat playbook that's being used by the Liberals in Canada, I hope it doesn't work. I don't think it's going to work, but you know, who knows? Maybe, right? Like they're basically going to do the same thing and coronate Mark Carney the same way that Biden and Hillary Clinton was coronated, and it's just really sad to see. I don't know what else to say. It's just the state of affairs in Canada right now. Before we move on to our final story, is there anything else you would like to add on this story?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, what you said about like how the tactics that the liberals are using with the Democratic Party, I guess the way I would phrase that is that the Democratic Party has spent the entire Obama years trying to avoid any kind of organic populist movement from rising in their party, which is probably because they're protecting special interests that don't want an organic political movement to rise through the Democratic Party. It's very much a top-down movement where like their policies are being made by the large institutional class, professor class. It's not a grassroots movement anymore. It's very corporatist, and I think that's the same with the liberals. And you can see that they're making a conceited effort to ensure that there isn't an organic grassroots political movement rising through the Liberal Party. And I mean, they shouldn't be too surprised that they can't come up with issues to connect with the voters anymore. Like this is why so many working class kitchen table voters are switching to conservative parties across the Western world because they don't feel like progressive parties are really focused on their interests.